Chapter 9 of The Wolf Hunters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adam Doughty. The Wolf Hunters by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 9. Wolf takes vengeance upon his people. From that hour was born in Roderick Drew's breast a strange, imperishable desire. Willingly at this moment would he have given up the winter trapping to have pursued that golden ignis fatuus of all ages, the lure of gold. To him the story of the old cabin, the skeletons, and the treasure of the buckskin bag was complete. Those skeletons had once been men. They had found a mine, a place where they had picked up nuggets with their fingers, and that treasure ground was somewhere near. No longer was he puzzled by the fact that they had discovered no more gold in the old log cabin. In a flash he had solved that mystery. The men had just begun to gather their treasure when they had fought. What was more logical than that? One day, 2, 3, and they'd quarrelled over division, over rights. That was the time when they were most likely to quarrel. Perhaps one had discovered the gold and had therefore claimed a larger share. Anyway, the contents of the buckskin bag represented but a few days' labour. Rod was sure of that. Mukoki had grinned and shrugged his shoulders with an air of stupendous doubt when Rod had told him that the gold lay between the mountains. So now the youth kept his thoughts to himself. It was a silent trail home. Rod's mind was too active in his new channel, and he was too deeply absorbed in impressing upon his memory certain landmarks which they passed to ask questions. And Mukoki, with the natural taciturnity of his race, seldom found occasion to break into conversation unless spoken to first. Although his eyes were constantly on the alert, Rod could see no way in which a descent could be made into the chasm from the ridge they were on. This was a little disappointing, for he had made up his mind to explore the gloomy, sunless gulch at his first opportunity. He had no doubt that Wabi would join in the adventure, or he might take his own time and explore it alone. He was reasonably sure that from somewhere on the opposite ridge a descent could be made into it. Wabi was in camp when they arrived. He had set 18 traps and had shot 2 spruce partridges. The birds were already cleaned for their early supper, and a thick slice of venison steak was added to the menu. During the preparation of the meal, Rod described their discovery of the chasm and revealed something of his thoughts concerning it, but Wabi betrayed only passing flashes of interest. At times he seemed strangely preoccupied and would stand in an idle, contemplative mood, his hands buried deep in his pockets, while Rod or Mukoki proceeded with little duties about the table or the stove. Finally, after arousing himself from one of these momentary spells, he pulled a brass shell from his pocket and held it out to the old Indian. "See here," he said, "I don't want to stir up any false fears or anything of that sort, but I found that on the trail today." Mukoki clutched at the shell as though it had been another newly found nugget of gold. The shell was empty. The lettering on the rim was still very distinct. He read, .35 rem. "Why, that's a shell from Rod's gun." For a few moments Rod and Mukoki stared at the young Indian in blank amazement. "It's a .35 caliber Remington," continued Wabi, "and it's an auto-loading shell. There are only 3 guns like that in this country. I've got one, Mukoki has another, and you lost the third in your fight with the Woongas." The venison had begun to burn, and Mukoki quickly transferred it to the table. Without a word, the 3 sat down to their meal. "That means the Woongas are on our trail," declared Rod presently. "That is what I've been trying to reason out all the afternoon," replied Wabi. "It certainly is proof that they are, or have been quite recently on this side of the mountain, but I don't believe they know we are here. The trail I struck was about 5 miles from camp. It was at least 2 days old. 3 Indians on snowshoes were traveling north. I followed back on their trail and found after a time that the Indians had come from the north, which leads me to believe that they were simply on a hunting expedition, cut a circle southward and then returned to their camp. I don't believe they will come farther south, but we must keep our eyes open." Wabi's description of the manner in which the strange trail turned gave great satisfaction to Mukoki, who nodded affirmatively when the young hunter expressed it as his belief that the Woongas would not come so far as their camp. But the discovery of their presence chilled the buoyant spirits of the hunters. There was, however, a new spice of adventure lurking in the possible peril that was not altogether displeasing, and by the time the meal was at an end, something like a plan of campaign had been formed. The hunters would not wait to be attacked and then act in self-defense, possibly at a disadvantage. They would be constantly on the lookout for the Woongas, and if a fresh trail or a camp was found, they would begin the manhunt themselves. The sun was just beginning to sink behind the distant hills in the southwest when the hunters again left camp. Wolf had received nothing to eat since the previous night, and with increasing hunger the fiery impatience lurking in his eyes and the restlessness of his movements became more noticeable. Mukoki called attention to these symptoms with a gloating satisfaction. The gloom of early evening was enveloping the wilderness by the time the 3 wolf hunters reached the swamp in which Rod had slain the buck. While he carried the guns in packs, Mukoki and Wabigoon dragged the buck between them to the huge flat-top rock. Now, for the first time, the city youth began to understand the old Pathfinder's scheme. Several saplings were cut, and by means of a long rope of babiche, the deer was dragged up the side of the rock until it rested securely upon the flat space. From the dead buck's neck, the babiche rope was now stretched across the intervening space between the rock and the clump of cedars in which the hunters were to conceal themselves. In 2 of these cedars, at a distance of a dozen feet from the ground, were quickly made 3 platforms of saplings, upon which the ambushed watchers could comfortably seat themselves. By the time complete darkness had fallen, the trap was finished, with the exception of a detail which Rod followed with great interest. From inside his clothes, where it had been kept warm by his body, Mukoki produced the flask of blood. A third of this blood he scattered upon the face of the rock and upon the snow at its base. The remainder he distributed, drop by drop, in trails running toward the swamp and plains. There still remained 3 hours before the moon would be up, and the hunters now joined Wolf, who had been fastened halfway up the ridge. In the shelter of a big rock, a small fire was built, and during their long waits the hunters passed the time away by broiling and eating chunks of venison, and in going over again the events of the day. It was 9 o'clock before the moon rose above the edge of the wilderness. This great orb of the northern night seemed to hold a never-ending fascination for Rod. It crept above the forests, a glowing, throbbing ball of red, quivering and palpitating in an effulgence that neither clouds nor mist dimmed in this desolation beyond the sphere of man. And as it rose, almost with visible movement to the eyes, the blood in it faded, until at last it seemed a great blaze of soft light between silver and gold. It was then that the whole world was lighted up under it. It was then that Mukoki, speaking softly, beckoned the others to follow him, and with Wolf at his side went down the ridge. Making a circuit around the back of the rock, Mukoki paused near a small sapling 20 yards from the dead buck, and secured Wolf by his babiche thong. Hardly had he done so when the animal began to exhibit signs of excitement. He trotted about nervously, sniffing the air, gathering the wind from every direction, and his jaws dropped with a snarling whine. Then he struck one of the clots of blood in the snow. "Come," whispered Wabi, pulling at Rod's sleeve. "Come, quietly." They slipped back among the shadows of the spruce and watched Wolf in unbroken silence. The animal now stood rigidly over the blood clot. His head was level with his quivering back, his ears half aslant, his nostrils pointing to a strange, thrilling scent that came to him from somewhere out there in the moonlight. Once more the instinct of his breed was flooding the soul of the captive wolf. There was the odor of blood in his widening nostrils. It was not the blood of the camp, of the slaughtered game dragged in by human hands before his eyes. It was the blood of the chase. A flashing memory of his captors turned the animal's head for an instant, in backward inspection. They were gone. He could neither hear nor see them. He sniffed the sign of human presence, but that sign was always with him and was not disturbing. The blood held him, and the strange scent, the game scent, that was coming to him more clearly every instant. He crunched about cautiously in the snow. He found other spots of blood, and to the watchers there came a low, long whine that seemed about to end in the wolf song. The blood trails were leading him away toward the game scent, and he tugged viciously at the babiche that held him captive, gnawing at it vainly like an angry dog, forgetting what experience had taught him many times before. Each moment added to his excitement. He ran about the sapling, gulped mouthfuls of the bloody snow, and each time he paused for a moment with his open, dripping jaws held toward the dead buck on the rock. The game was very near. Brute sense told him that. Oh, the longing that was in him, the twitching, quivering longing to kill, kill, kill. He made another effort, tore up the snow in his frantic endeavors to free himself, to break loose, to follow in the wild, glad cry of freed savagery and the calling of his people. He failed again, panting, whining in piteous helplessness. Then he settled upon his haunches at the end of his babiche thong. For a moment his head turned to the moonlit sky, his long nose poised at right angles to the bristling hollows between his shoulders. There came then a low, whining wail, like the beginning of the death song of a husky dog, a wail that grew in length and in strength and in volume until it rose weirdly among the mountains and swept far out over the plains, the hunt call of the wolf on the trail, which calls to him the famished, grey-gaunt outlaws of the wilderness, as the bugler's notes call his fellows on the field of battle. 3 times that blood-thrilling cry went up from the captive wolf's throat, and before those cries had died away, the 3 hunters were perched upon their platforms among the spruce. There followed now the ominous waiting silence of an awakened wilderness. Rod could hear his heart throbbing within him. He forgot the intense cold. His nerves tingled. He looked out over the endless plains, white and mysteriously beautiful as they lay, bathed in the glow of the moon. And Wabi knew more than he what was happening. All over that wild desolation the call of the wolf had carried its meaning. Down there, where a lake lay silent in its winter sleep, a doe started in trembling and fear. Beyond the mountain a huge bull moose lifted his antlered head with battle-glaring eyes. Half a mile away a fox paused for an instant in its sleuth-like stalking of a rabbit, and here and there in that world of wild things the gaunt, hungry people of wolf's blood stopped in their trails and turned their heads toward the signal that was coming in wailing echoes to their ears. And then the silence was broken. From afar, it might have been a mile away, there came an answering cry, and at that cry the wolf at the end of his babiche thong settled upon his haunches again, and sent back the call that comes only when there is blood upon the trail, or when near the killing time. There was not the rustle of a bough, not a word spoken by the silent watchers in the spruce. Mukoki had slipped back and half lay across his support in shooting attitude. Wabi had braced a foot, and his rifle was half to his shoulder, levelled over a knee. It was Rod's turn with the big revolver, and he had practiced aiming through a crotch that gave a rest to his arm. In a few moments there came again the howl of the distant wolf on the plains, and this time it was joined by another away to the westward. And after that there came 2 from the plains instead of 1, then a far cry to the north and east. For the first time Rod and Wabi heard the gloating chuckle of Mukoki in his spruce a dozen feet away. At the increasing responses of his brethren, Wolf became more frantic in his efforts. The scent of fresh blood and the wounded game was becoming maddening to the captive, but his frenzy no longer betrayed itself in futile efforts to escape from the babiche thong. Wolf knew that his cries were assembling the hunt pack. Nearer and nearer came the responses of the leaders, and there were now only momentary rests between the deep-throated exhortations which he sent in all directions into the night. Suddenly, almost from the swamp itself, there came a quick, excited, yelping reply, and Wabi gripped Rod by the arm. "He has struck the place where you killed the buck," he whispered. "There'll be quick work now." Hardly had he spoken when a series of excited howls broke forth from the swamp, coming nearer and nearer as the hunger-crazed outlaw of the plains followed over the rich scented trail made by the two Indians as they carried the slaughtered deer. Soon he nosed one of the trails of blood, and a moment later the watchers saw a gaunt shadow form running swiftly over the snow toward Wolf. For an instant, as the two beasts of prey met, there fell a silence. Then both animals joined in the wailing hunt-pack cry, and the wolf that was free came to the edge of the great rock and stood with his forefeet on its side, and his cry changed from that of the chase to the still more thrilling signal that told the gathering pack of game at bay. Swiftly the wolves closed in. From over the edge of the mountain one came and joined the wolf at the rock without the hunters seeing his approach. From out of the swamp there came a pack of three, and now about the rock there grew a maddened, yelping horde, clambering and scrambling and fighting in their efforts to climb up to the game that was so near and yet beyond their reach. And 60 feet away Wolf crouched, watching the gathering of his clan, helpless, panting from his choking efforts to free himself, and quieting, gradually quieting, until, in sullen silence, he looked upon the scene, as though he knew the moment was very near when that thrilling spectacle would be changed into a scene of direst tragedy. And it was Mukoki who had first said that this was the vengeance of Wolf upon his people. From Mukoki there now came a faint hissing warning, and Wabi threw his rifle to his shoulder. There were at least a score of wolves at the base of the rock. Gradually the old Indian pulled upon the babeesh rope that led to the dead buck, pulled until he was putting half of his strength into the effort, and could feel the animal slowly slipping from the flat ledge. A moment more and the buck tumbled down in the midst of the waiting pack. As flies gather upon a lump of sugar, the famished animals now crowded and crushed and fought over the deer's body, and as they came thus together there sounded the quick, sharp signal to fire from Mukoki. For 5 seconds the edge of the spruce was a blaze of death-dealing flashes, and the deafening reports of the two rifles and the big Colt drowned the cries and struggles of the animals. When those 5 seconds were over, 15 shots had been fired, and 5 seconds later the vast, beautiful silence of the wilderness night had fallen again. About the rock was the silence of death, broken only faintly by the last gasping throes of the animals that lay dying in the snow. In the trees there sounded the metallic clink of loading shells. Wabi spoke first. "I believe we did a good job, Mukoki." Mukoki's reply was to slip down his tree. The others followed and hastened across to the rock. 5 bodies lay motionless in the snow. A 6th was dragging himself around the side of the rock, and Mukoki attacked it with his belt axe. Still a 7th had run for a dozen rods, leaving a crimson trail behind, and when Wabi and Rod came up to it, the animal was convulsed in its last dying struggles. "7!" exclaimed the Indian youth. "That is one of the best shoots we ever had. $105 in a night isn't bad, is it?" The two came back to the rock, dragging the wolf with them. Mukoki was standing as rigid as a statue in the moonlight. His face turned into the north. He pointed one arm far out over the plains and said, without turning his head, "See." Far out in that silent desolation the hunters saw a lurid flash of flame. It climbed up and up until it filled the night above it with a dull glow, a single unbroken stream of fire that rose far above the swamps and forests of the plains. "That's a burning jack pine," said Wabigoon. "Burning jack pine," agreed the old warrior. Then he added, "Woonga signal fire." End of Chapter 9. Recording by Adam Doughty, Kerry, New Zealand. Chapter 10 of The Wolf Hunters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adam Doughty. The Wolf Hunters, by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 10. Roderick explores the chasm. To Rod, the blazing pine seemed to be but a short distance away, a mile, perhaps a little more. In the silence of the two Indians as they contemplated the strange fire, he read an ominous meaning. In Mukoki's eyes was a dull, sullen glare, not unlike that which fills the orbs of a wild beast in a moment of deadly anger. Wabi's face was filled with an eager flush, and 3 times, Rod observed, he turned eyes strangely burning with some unnatural passion upon Mukoki. Slowly, even as the instincts of his race had aroused the latent brutish love of slaughter and the chase in the tamed wolf, the long smothered instincts of these human children of the forest began to betray themselves in their bronzed countenances. Rod watched, and he was thrilled to the soul. Back at the old cabin they had declared war upon the Woongas. Both Mukoki and Wabigoon had slipped their leashes that had long restrained them from meeting the first vengeance upon their enemies. Now the opportunity had come. For 5 minutes the great pine blazed and then died away until it was only a smouldering tower of light. Still Mukoki gazed, speechless and grim, out into the distance of the night. At last Wabi broke the silence. "How far away is it, Muki?" "3 mile," answered the old warrior without hesitation. "We could make it in 40 minutes." "Yes." Wabi turned to Rod. "You can find your own way back to camp alone, can't you?" he asked. "Not if you're going over there," declared the white boy. "I'm going with you." Mukoki broke in upon them with a harsh, disappointed laugh. "No go! No go over there!" He spoke with emphasis and shook his head. "We lose pine in 5 minutes. No find Woonga camp. Make big trail for Woongas to see in morning. Better wait. Follow 'em trail in day. Then shoot." Rod found immense relief in the old Indian's decision. He did not fear a fight. In fact, he was a little too anxious to meet the outlaws who had stolen his gun, now that they had determined upon opening fire on sight. But in this instance he was possessed of the cooler judgment of his race. He believed that as yet the Woongas were not aware of their presence in this region, and that there was still a large possibility of the renegades traveling northward beyond their trapping sphere. He hoped that this would be the case, in spite of his desire to recapture his gun. A scrimmage with the Woongas just now would spoil the plans he had made for discovering gold. The skeleton mine, as he had come to call it, now absorbed his thoughts beyond everything else. He felt confident that he would discover the lost treasure ground if given time, and he was just as confident that if war was once begun between themselves and the Woongas, it would mean disaster or quick flight from the country. Even Wabi, worked up more in battle enthusiasm than by gold fever, conceded that if half of the Woongas were in this country they were much too powerful for them to cope with successfully, especially as one of them was without a rifle. It was therefore with inward exultation that Rod saw the project of attack dropped, and Mukoki and Wabigoon proceed with their short task of scalping the 7 wolves. During this operation, Wolf was allowed to feast upon the carcass of the buck. That night there was but little sleep in the old cabin. It was 2 o'clock when the hunters arrived in camp, and from that hour until nearly 4 they sat about the hot stove making plans for the day that was nearly at hand. Rod could but contrast the excitement that now had taken possession of them with the tranquil joy with which they had first taken up their abode in this dip in the hilltop. And how different were their plans from those of 2 or 3 days ago. Not one of them now but realized their peril. They were in an ideal hunting range, but it was evidently very near, if not actually in, the Woonga country. At any moment they might be forced to fight for their lives or abandon their camp, and perhaps they would be compelled to do both. So the gathering about the stove was in reality a small council of war. It was decided that the old cabin should immediately be put into a condition of defense, with a loophole on each side, strong new bars at the door, and with a thick barricade near at hand that could be quickly fitted against the window in case of attack. Until the wall clouds cleared away, if they cleared at all, the camp would be continually guarded by one of the hunters, and with this garrison would be left both of the heavy revolvers. At dawn or a little later, Mukoki would set out upon Wabi's trap line, both to become acquainted with it and to extend the line of traps, while later in the day the Indian youth would follow Mukoki's line, visiting the houses already built and setting other traps. This scheme left to Rod the first day's watch in camp. Mukoki aroused himself from his short sleep with the first approach of dawn, but did not awaken his tired companions until breakfast was ready. When the meal was finished, he seized the gun and signified his intention of visiting the mink traps just beyond the hill, before leaving on his long day's trail. Rod at once joined him, leaving Wabi to wash the dishes. They were shortly within view of the trap houses near the creek. Instinctively, the eyes of both rested upon these houses, and neither gave very close attention to the country ahead or about them. As a result, both were exceedingly startled when they heard a huge snort and a great crunching in the deep snow close beside them. From out of a small growth of alders had dashed a big bull moose, who was now tearing with the speed of a horse up the hillside toward the hidden camp, evidently seeking the quick shelter of the dip. "Wait him! Get top of hill!" shouted Mukoki, swinging his rifle to his shoulder. "Wait!" It was a beautiful shot, and Rod was tempted to ignore the old Indian's advice. But he knew there was some good reason for it, so he held his trembling finger. Hardly had the animal's huge antlered head risen to the skyline when Mukoki shouted again, and the young hunter pressed the trigger of his automatic gun 3 times in rapid succession. It was a short shot, not more than 200 yards, and Mukoki fired but once just as the bull mounted the hilltop. The next instant the moose was gone, and Rod was just about to dash in pursuit when his companion caught him by the arm. "We got him," he grinned. "He run downhill, then fall very close to camp. Very good scheme. Wait him get on top hill. No have to carry meat far." As coolly as though nothing had happened, the Indian turned again in the direction of the traps. Rod stood as though he had been nailed to the spot, his mouth half open in astonishment. "We go see traps," urged Mukoki. "Find moose dead when we go back." But Roderick Drew, who had hunted nothing larger than house rats in his own city, was not the young man to see the logic of this reasoning, and before Mukoki could open his mouth again he was hurrying up the hill. On its summit he saw a huge torn-up blotch in the snow, spattered with blood, where the moose had fallen first after the shots, and at the foot of the hill, as the Indian had predicted, the great animal lay dead. Wabi was hastening across the lake, attracted by the shots, and both reached the slain bull at about the same time. Rod quickly perceived that 3 shots had taken effect. One, which was undoubtedly Mukoki's carefully directed ball, in a vital spot between the foreleg, and 2 through the body. The fact that 2 of his own shots had taken good effect filled the white youth with enthusiasm, and he was still gesticulating excitedly and describing the bull's flight to Wabi when the old Indian came over the hill, grinning broadly and holding up for their inspection a magnificent mink. The day could not have begun more auspiciously for the hunters, and by the time Mukoki was ready to leave upon his long trail, the adventurers were in buoyant spirits, the distressing fears of the preceding night being somewhat dispelled by their present good fortune, and the glorious day which now broke in full splendor upon the wilderness. Until their early dinner, Wabi remained in camp, securing certain parts of the moose and assisting Rod in putting the cabin into a state of defense according to their previous plans. It was not yet noon when he started over Mukoki's trap line. Left to his own uninterrupted thoughts, Rod's mind was once more absorbed in his scheme of exploring the mysterious chasm. He had noticed during his inspection from the top of the ridge that the winter snows had as yet fallen but little in the gloomy gulch between the mountains, and he was eager to attempt his adventure before either snows came, or the fierce blizzards of December filled the chasm with drifts. Later in the afternoon he brought forth the buckskin bag from a niche in the log wall where it had been concealed, and one after another carefully examined the golden nuggets. He found, as he had expected, that they were worn to exceeding smoothness, and that every edge had been dulled and rounded. Rod's favorite study in school had been a minor branch of geology and mineralogy, and he knew that only running water would work this smoothness. He was therefore confident that the nuggets had been discovered in or on the edge of a running stream, and that stream, he was sure, was the one in the chasm. But Rod's plans for an early investigation were doomed to disappointment. Late that day both Mukoki and Wabi returned, the latter with a red fox and another mink, the former with a fisher, which reminded Rod of a dog just growing out of puppyhood, and another story of strange trail that renewed their former apprehensions. The old Indian had discovered the remains of the burned jack pine, and about it were the snowshoe tracks of 3 Indians. One of these trails came from the north and 2 from the west, which led him to believe that the pine had been fired as a signal to call the 2. At the very end of their trap line, which extended about 4 miles from the camp, a single snowshoe trail had cut across at right angles, also swinging into the north. These discoveries necessitated a new arrangement of the plans that had been made the preceding night. Hereafter, it was agreed, only 1 trapline would be visited each day, and by 2 of the hunters in company, both armed with rifles. Rod saw that this meant the abandonment of his scheme for exploring the chasm, at least for the present. Day after day now passed without evidences of new trails, and each day added to the hopes of the adventurers that they were at last to be left alone in the country. Never had Mukoki or Wabigoon been in a better trapping ground, and every visit to their lines added to their hoard of furs. If left unmolested, it was plainly evident that they would take a small fortune back to Wabinoosh House with them early in the spring. Besides many mink, several fisher, 2 red foxes and a link, they added 2 fine cross foxes and 3 wolf scalps to their treasure during the next 3 weeks. Rod began to think occasionally of the joy their successes would bring to the little home hundreds of miles away, where he knew that the mother was waiting and praying for him every day of her life. And there were times, too, when he found himself counting the days that must still elapse before he returned to Minnetaki and the post. But at no time did he give up his determination to explore the chasm. From the first, Mukoki and Wabigoon still regarded this project with little favor, declaring the impossibility of discovering gold under snow, even though gold was there. So Rod waited and watched for an opportunity to make the search alone, saying nothing about his plans. On a beautiful day late in December, when the sun rose with dazzling brightness, his opportunity came. Wabi was to remain in camp, and Mukoki, who was again of the belief that they were safe from the Woongas, was to follow one of the trap lines alone. Supplying himself well with food, taking Wabi's rifle, a double allowance of cartridges, a knife, belt axe, and a heavy blanket from his pack, Rod set out for the chasm. Wabi laughed as he stood in the doorway to see him off. "Good luck to you, Rod. Hope you find gold," he cried gaily, waving a final goodbye with his hand. "If I don't return tonight, don't you fellows worry about me," called back the youth. "If things look promising, I may camp in the chasm and take up the hunt again in the morning." He now passed quickly into the second ridge, knowing from previous experience that it would be impossible to make a descent into the gulch from the first mountain. This range, a mile south from the camp, had not been explored by the hunters, but Rod was sure that there was no danger of losing himself as long as he followed along the edge of the chasm, which was in itself a constant and infallible guide. Much to his disappointment, he found that the southern walls of this mysterious break between the mountains were as precipitous as those on the opposite side, and for 2 hours he looked in vain for a place where he might climb down. The country was now becoming densely wooded, and he was constantly encountering signs of big game, but he paid little attention to these. Finally he came to a point where the forest swept over and down the steep side of the mountain, and to his great joy he saw that by strapping his snowshoes to his back and making good use of his hands, it was possible for him to make a descent. 15 minutes later, breathless but triumphant, he stood at the bottom of the chasm. On his right rose the strip of cedar forest. On his left he was shut in by towering walls of black and shattered rock. At his feet was the little stream which had played such an important part in his golden dreams, frozen in places, and in others kept clear of ice by the swiftness of its current. A little ahead of him was that gloomy, sunless part of the chasm into which he had peered so often from the top of the ridge on the north. As he advanced step by step into its mysterious silence, his eyes alert, his nerves stretched to a tension of the keenest expectancy, there crept over him a feeling that he was invading that enchanted territory which, even at this moment, might be guarded by the spirits of the 2 mortals who had died because of the treasure it held. Narrower and narrower became the walls high over his head. Not a ray of sunshine penetrated into the soulless gloom. Not a leaf shivered in the still air. The creek gurgled and spattered among its rocks without the note of a bird or the chirp of a squirrel to interrupt its monotony. Everything was dead. Now and then Rod could hear the wind whispering over the top of the chasm, but not a breath of it came down to him. Under his feet was only sufficient snow to deaden his own footsteps, and he still carried his snowshoes upon his back. Suddenly, from the thick gloom that hung under one of the craggy walls, there came a thundering, unearthly sound that made him stop, his rifle swung half to shoulder. He saw that he had disturbed a great owl, and passed on. Now and then he paused beside the creek and took up handful after handful of its pebbles, his heart beating high with hope at every new gleam he caught among them, and never sinking to disappointment though he found no gold. The gold was here, somewhere. He was as certain of that as he was of the fact that he was living and searching for it. Everything assured him of that, the towering masses of cleft rock, whole walls seeming about to crumble into ruin, the broad margins of pebbles along the creek, everything, to the very stillness and mystery of the air, spoke this as the abode of the skeleton's secret. It was this inexplicable something, this unseen, mysterious element hovering in the air that caused the white youth to advance step by step, silently, cautiously, as though the slightest sound under his feet might awaken the deadliest of enemies. And it was because of this stealth in his progress that he came very close upon something that was living, and without startling it. Less than 50 yards ahead of him he saw an object moving slowly among the rocks. It was a fox. Even before the animal had detected his presence, he had aimed and fired. Thunderous echoes rose up about him. They rolled down the chasm, volume upon volume, until in the ghostly gloom between the mountain walls he stood and listened, a nervous shiver catching him once or twice. Not until the last echo had died away did he approach where the fox lay upon the snow. It was not red. It was not black. It was not... His heart gave a big, excited thump. The bleeding creature at his feet was the most beautiful animal he had ever seen, and the tip of its thick black fur was silver grey. Then, in that lonely chasm, there went up a great human whoop of joy. A silver fox! Rod spoke the words aloud. For 5 minutes he stood and looked upon his prize. He held it up and stroked it, and from what Wabi and Mukoki had told him, he knew that the silken pelt of this creature was worth more to them than all the furs at the camp together. He made no effort to skin it, but put the animal in his pack and resumed his slow, noiseless exploration of the gulch. He had now passed beyond those points in the range from which he had looked down into this narrow, shut-in world. Ever more wild and gloomy became the chasm. At times the two walls of rock seemed almost to meet far above his head. Under gigantic overhanging crags there lurked the shadows of night. Fascinated by the grandeur and loneliness of the scenes through which he was passing, Rod forgot the travel of time. Mile after mile he continued his tireless trail. He had no inclination to eat. He stopped only once at the creek to drink, and when he looked at his watch he was astonished to find it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was now too late to think of returning to camp. Within an hour the day gloom of the chasm would be thickening into that of night. So Rod stopped at the first good campsite, threw off his pack, and proceeded with the building of a cedar shelter. Not until this was completed and a sufficient supply of wood for the night's fire was at hand did he begin getting supper. He had brought a pail with him, and soon the appetizing odors of boiling coffee and broiling moose sirloins filled the air. Night had fallen between the mountain walls by the time Rod sat down to his meal. End of Chapter 10. Recording by Adam Doughty, Kerry, New Zealand.
Chapter 11 of the Wolf Hunters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ted Nugent The Wolf Hunters by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 11. Roderick's Dream. A chilling loneliness now crept over the young adventurer. Even as he ate, he tried to peer out into the mysterious darkness. A sound from up the chasm, made by some wild prowler of the night, sent a nervous tremor through him. He was not afraid. He would not have confessed to that. But still, the absolute, almost gruesome silence between the two mountains, the mere knowledge that he was alone in a place where the foot of man had not trod for more than half a century, was not altogether quieting to his nerves. What mysterious might not these grim walls hold? What might not happen here, where everything was so strange, so weird, and so different from the wilderness world just over the range? Rod tried to laugh away his nervousness, but the very sound of his own voice was distressing. It rose in unnatural shivering echoes, a low, hollow mockery of a laugh beating itself against the walls. A ghost of a laugh, Rod thought, and that very thought made him hunch closer to the fire. The young hunter was not superstitious, or at least he was not unnaturally so. But what man or boy is there in this whole wide world of ours who does not, at some time, inwardly cringe from something in the air, something that does not exist and never did exist, but which holds a peculiar and nameless fear for the soul of a human being? And Rod, as he piled his fire high with wood and shrank in the warmth of his cedar shelter, felt that nameless dread. And there came to him no thought of sleep, no feeling of fatigue, but only that he was alone, absolutely alone, in the mystery and almost unending silence of the chasm. Try as he would, he could not keep from his mind the vision of the skeletons as he had first seen them in the old cabin. Many, many years ago, even before his own mother was born, those skeletons had trod this very chasm. They had drunk from the same creek as he. They had clambered over the same rocks. They had camped, perhaps, where he was camping now. They too, in flesh and life, had strained their ears in the grim silence. They had watched the flickering light of the campfire on the walls of rock. They had found gold. Just now, if Rod could have moved himself by magic, he would have been safely back in camp. He listened. From far back over the trail he had followed, there came a lonely, plaintive, almost pleading cry. "Hello, hello, hello." It sounded like a distant human greeting, but Rod knew that it was the awakening night cry of what Wabi called the man owl. It was weirdly human-like, and the echoes came softly and more softly until ghostly voices seemed to be whispering in the blackness about him. "Hello, hello, hello." The boy shivered and laid his rifle across his knees. There was tremendous comfort in the rifle. Rod fondled it with his fingers, and 2 or 3 times he felt as though he would almost like to talk to it. Only those who have gone far into the silence and desolation of the unblazed wilderness know just how human a good rifle becomes to its owner. It is a friend every hour of the night and day, faithful to its master's desires, keeping starvation at bay and holding death for his enemies. A guarantee of safety at his bedside by night, a sharp-fanged watchdog by day, never treacherous and never found wanting by the one who bestows upon it the care of a comrade and friend. Thus, had Rod came to look upon his rifle. He rubbed the barrel now with his mittens. He polished the stock as he sat in his loneliness, and long afterward, though he had determined to remain awake during the night, he fell asleep with it clasped tightly in his hands. It was an uneasy, troubled slumber, in which the young adventurer's visions and fears took a more realistic form. He half sat, half lay upon his cedar bounds. His head fell forward upon his breast. His feet were stretched out to the fire. Now and then, unintelligible sounds fell from his lips, and he would start suddenly as if about to awaken, but each time would sink back into his restless sleep, still clutching the gun. The vision in his head began to take a more definite form. Once more, he was on the trail, and had come to the old cabin, but this time he was alone. The window of the cabin was wide open, but the door was tightly closed, just as the hunters had found it when they first came down into the deep. He approached cautiously. When very near the window, he heard sounds, strange sounds, like the clicking of bones. Step by step in his dream, he approached the window and looked in, and there he beheld a sight that froze him to the marrow. Two huge skeletons were struggling in deathly embrace. He could hear no sound but the click, click, click of their bones. He saw the gleam of knives held between fleshless fingers, and he saw now that both were struggling for the possession of something that was upon the table. Now one almost reached it, now the other, but neither gained possession. The clicking of the bones became louder, the struggle fiercer. The knives of the skeleton combatants rose and fell. Then one staggered back and sank in a heap on the floor. For a moment, the victor swayed, tottered to the table, and gripped the mysterious object in his bony fingers. As it stumbled weakly against the cabin wall, the gruesome creature held the object up, and Rod saw that it was a roll of birch bark. An ember in the dying fire snapped with a sound like the report of a small piston, and Rod sat bolt upright, awake, staring, trembling. What a horrible dream! He drew in his cramped legs and approached the fire on his knees, holding his rifle in one hand, while he piled on wood with the other. What a horrible dream! He shuddered and ran his eyes around the impenetrable wall of blackness that shut him in, the thought constantly flashing through his mind. What a horrible dream! What a horrible dream! He sat down again and watched the flames of his fire as they climbed higher and higher. The light and the heat cheered him, and after a little he allowed his mind to dwell upon the adventure of his slumber. It had made him sweat. He took off his cap and found that the hair about his forehead was damp. All the different phases of a dream returned to one simply when awake, and it was with the suddenness of a shot that there came to Rod a remembrance of the skeleton held aloft, clutching between its gleaming fleshless fingers the roll of birch bark. And with that memory of his dream there came another. The skeleton in the cabin was clutching a piece of birch bark when they had buried it. Could that crumbled bit of bark hold the secret of the lost mine? Was it for the possession of that bark instead of the buckskin bag that the man had fought and died? As the minutes passed, Rod forgot his loneliness, forgot his nervousness, and only thought of the possibilities of the new clue that had come to him in a dream. Wabi and Mukoki had seen the bark clutched in the skeleton fingers, but they, as well as he, have given it no special significance, believing that it had been caught up in some terrible part of the struggle when both combatants were upon the floor, or perhaps in the dying agonies of the wounded man against the world. Rod remembered now that they had found no more birch bark upon the floor, which they would have done if a supply had been kept there for kindling fires. Step by step, he went over the search they had made in the old cabin, and more satisfied did he become that the skeleton held something of importance for them. He replenished his fire and waited impatiently for dawn. At 4 o'clock, before day had begun to dispel the gloom of night, he cooked his breakfast and prepared his pack for the homeward journey. Soon afterwards, a narrow rim of light broke through the rift in the chasm. Slowly it crept downward until the young hunter could make out of objects near him and the walls of the mountains. Thick shadows still defined his vision when he began retracing his steps over the trail he had made the day before. He returned with the same caution that he had used in his advance. Even more carefully, if possible, did he scrutinize the rocks and the creek ahead. He had already found life in the chasm, and he might find more. The full light of day came quickly now, and with it, the youth's progress became more rapid. He figured that if he lost no time in further investigation of the creek, he would arrive at camp by noon, and they would dig up the skeleton without delay. There was still snow in the chasm, in spite of the lateness of the season, and if the roll of bark held the secret of the lost gold, it would be possible for them to locate the treasure before other snows came to baffle them. At the spot where he had killed the silver fox, Rod paused for a moment. He wondered if foxes ever traveled in pairs, and regretted that he had not asked Wabi or Mukoki that question. He could see where the fox had come from, straight from the black wall of the mountain. Curiosity led him over the trail. He had not followed it more than 200 yards when he stopped in sudden astonishment. Plainly marked in the snow before him was the trail of a pair of snowshoes. Whoever had been there has passed since he shot the fox, for the imprints of the animal's feet were buried under those of the snowshoes. Who was the other person in the chasm? Was it Wabi? Has Mukoki or he come to join him? Or... He looked again at the snowshoe trail. It was a peculiar trail, unlike the one made by his own shoes. The imprints were a foot longer than his own, and narrower. Neither Wabi or Mukoki wore shoes that would make that trail. At this point, the strange trail had turned and disappeared among the rocks along the wall of the mountain, and it occurred to Rod that perhaps the stranger had not discovered his presence in the chasm. There was some consolation in this thought, but it was doomed to quick disappointment. Very cautiously, the youth advanced, his rifle held in readiness, and his eyes searching every place of concealment ahead of him. 100 yards further on, the stranger had stopped, and from the way in which the snow was packed, Rod knew that he had stood in a listening and watchful attitude for some time. From this point, the trail took another turn and came down until, from behind a huge rock, the stranger had cautiously peered down upon the path made by the white youth. It was evident that he was extremely anxious to prevent the discovery of his own trail. For now, the mysterious spy threaded his way behind the rocks until he had again come to the shelter of the mountain wall. Rod was perplexed. He realized the peril of his dilemma, and yet he knew not what course to take to evade it. He had little doubt that the trail was made by one of the treacherous Woongas, and that the Indian not only knew of his presence, but was somewhere in the rocks ahead of him, perhaps even now waiting behind some ambuscade to shoot him. Should he follow the trail, or would it be safer to steal along among the rocks of the opposite wall of the chasm? He had decided upon the latter course when his eyes caught a narrow horizontal slit, cleaving the face of the mountain on his left, towards which the snowshoe track seemed to lead. With his rifle ready for instant use, the youth slowly approached the fissure, and was surprised to find that it was a complete break in the wall of rock, not more than 4 feet wide, and continuing on a steadily incline to the summit of the ridge. At the mouth of his fissure, his mysterious watcher had taken off his snowshoes, and Rod could see where he had climbed up the narrow exit from the chasm. With a profound sense of relief, the young hunter hurried along the base of the mountain, keeping well within its shelter, so that eyes that might be spying from above could not see his movements. He now felt no fear of danger. The stranger's flight up the cleft in the chasm wall, and his careful attempts to conceal his trail along the rocks, assured Rod that he had no designs upon his life. His chief purpose had seemed to be to keep secret of his own presence in the gorge, and this fact in itself added to the mystification of the white youth. For a long time he had been secretly puzzled, and had developed certain ideas of his own. because of the movements of the Ongas. Contrary to the opinions of Mukoki and Wabigoon, he believed that the Red Outlaws were perfectly conscious of their presence in the deep. From the first, their actions had been unaccountable, but not once had one of their snowshoe trails crossed their trap lines. Was this fact in itself not significant? Rod was of a contemplative, theoretical turn of mind, one of those wide-awake, interesting young fellows who find food for conjecture in almost every incident that occurs, and his suspicions were now aroused to an unusual pitch. A chief fault, however, was that he kept most of his suspicions to himself, for he believed that Mukoki and Wabigoon, born and taught in the life of the wilderness, were infallible in their knowledge of the ways and the laws and the perils of the world they were in. End of chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of The Wolf Hunters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Wesseling. The Wolf Hunters by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 12. The Secret of the Skeleton's Hand. A little before noon, Rod arrived at the top of the hill from which he could look down on their camp. He was filled with pleasurable anticipation, and with an unbounded, swelling satisfaction that caused him to smile as he proceeded into the dip. He had found a fortune in the mysterious chasm. The burden of the silver fox upon his shoulders was a most pleasing reminder of that, and he pictured the moment when the good-natured raillery of Mukoki and Wabigoon would be suddenly turned into astonishment and joy. As he approached the cabin, the young hunter tried to appear disgusted and half-sick, and his effort was not bad in spite of his decided inclination to laugh. Wabi met him at the doorway, grinning broadly, and Mukoki greeted him with a throatful of his inimitable chuckles. "Aha! Here's Rod with a pack full of gold," cried the young Indian, striking an expectant attitude. "Will you let us see the treasure?" In spite of his banter, there was gladness in his face at Rod's arrival. The youth threw off his pack with a spiritless effort and flopped into a chair as though in the last stage of exhaustion. "You'll have to undo the pack," he replied. "I'm too tired and hungry." Wabi's manner changed at once to one of real sympathy. "I'll bet you're tired, Rod, and half-starved. We'll have dinner in a hurry. Ho, Muki, put on the steak, will you?" There followed a rattle of kettles and tin pans, and the Indian youth gave Rod a glad slap on the back as he hurried to the table. He was evidently in high spirits, and burst into a snatch of song as he cut up a loaf of bread. "I'm tickled to see you back," he admitted, "for I was getting a little bit nervous. We had splendid luck on our lines yesterday. Brought in another cross, and 3 mink. Did you see anything? Aren't you going to look in the pack?" Wabi turned and gazed at his companion with a half-curious, hesitating smile. "Anything in it?" he asked suspiciously. "See here, boys," cried Rod, forgetting himself in his suppressed enthusiasm. "I said there was a treasure in that chasm, and there was. I found it. You are welcome to look into that pack if you wish." Wabi dropped the knife with which he was cutting the bread and went to the pack. He touched it with the toe of his boot, lifted it in his hands, and glanced at Rod again. "It isn't a joke?" he asked. "No." Rod turned his back upon the scene and began to take off his coat as coolly as though it were the commonest thing in the world for him to bring silver foxes into camp. Only when Wabi gave a suppressed yell did he turn about, and then he found the Indian standing erect and holding out the silver to the astonished gaze of Mukoki. "Is it a good one?" he asked. "A beauty!" gasped Wabi. Mukoki had taken the animal and was examining it with the critical eyes of a connoisseur. "Ver fine," he said. "At post, him worth $500. At Montreal, 300 more." Wabi strode across the cabin and thrust out his hand. "Shake, Rod." As the two gripped hands, he turned to Mukoki. "Bear witness, Mukoki, that this young gentleman is no longer a tenderfoot. He has shot a silver fox. He has done a whole winter's work in one day. I take off my hat to you, Mr. Drew." Roderick's face reddened with a flush of pleasure. "And that isn't all, Wabi," he said. His eyes were filled with a sudden intense earnestness, and in the strangeness of the change, Wabi forgot to loosen the grip of his fingers about his companion's hand. "You don't mean that you found—" "No, I didn't find gold," anticipated Rod. "But the gold is there. I know it. And I think I have found a clue. You remember that when you and I examined the skeleton against the wall, we saw that it clutched something that looked like birch bark in its hand? Well, I believe that birch bark holds the key to the lost mine." Mukoki had come beside them and stood listening to Rod, his face alive with keen interest. In Wabi's eyes there was a look half of doubt, half of belief. "It might," he said slowly. "It wouldn't do any harm to see." He stepped to the stove and took off the partly cooked meat. Rod slipped on his coat and hat, and Mukoki seized his belt axe and the shovel. No words were spoken, but there was a mutual understanding that the investigation was to precede dinner. Wabi was silent and thoughtful, and Rod could see that his suggestion had at least made a deep impression upon him. Mukoki's eyes began to gleam again with the old fire with which he had searched the cabin for gold. The skeletons were buried only a few inches deep in the frozen earth in the edge of the cedar forest, and Mukoki soon exposed them to view. Almost the first object that met their eyes was the skeleton hand clutching its roll of birch bark. It was Rod who dropped upon his knees to the gruesome task. With a shudder at the touch of the cold bones, he broke the fingers back. One of them snapped with a sharp sound, and as he rose with the bark in his hand, his face was bloodlessly white. The bones were covered again, and the three returned to the cabin. Still silent, they gathered about the table. With age, the bark of the birch hardens and rolls itself tightly, and the piece Rod held was almost like thin steel. Inch by inch it was spread out, cracking and snapping in brittle protest. The hunters could see that the bark was in a single, unbroken strip, about 10 inches long by 6 in width. 2 inches, 3, 4 were unrolled, and still the smooth surface was blank. Another half inch, and the bark refused to unroll farther. "Careful!" whispered Wabi. With the point of his knife, he loosened the cohesion. "I guess there's nothing," began Rod. Even as he spoke, he caught his breath. A mark had appeared on the bark, a black, meaningless mark with a line running down from it into the scroll. Another fraction of an inch and the line was joined by a second. And then, with an unexpectedness that was startling, the remainder of the roll released itself like a spring, and to the eyes of the three wolf hunters was revealed the secret of the skeleton hand. Spread out before them was a map, or at least what they at once accepted as a map, though in reality it was more of a crude diagram of straight and crooked lines, with here and there a partly obliterated word to give it meaning. In several places there were mere evidences of words, now entirely illegible. But what first held the attention of Rod and his companions were several lines in writing under the rough sketch on the bark, still quite plain, which formed the names of 3 men. Roderick read them aloud. John Ball, Henri Langlois, Peter Plante. Through the name of John Ball had been drawn a broad black line which had almost destroyed the letters, and at the end of this line, in brackets, was printed a word in French, which Wabi quickly translated. "Dead," he breathed. "The Frenchman killed him." The words shot from him in hot excitement. Rod did not reply. Slowly he drew a trembling finger over the map. The first word he encountered was unintelligible. Of the next, he could only make out one letter, which gave him no clue. Evidently, the map had been made with a different and less durable substance than that with which the names had been written. He followed down the first straight black line, and where this formed a junction with a wider crooked line were 2 words, quite distinct. Second Waterfall. Half an inch below this, Rod could make out the letters T, D, and L, widely scattered. "That's the 3rd waterfall!" he exclaimed eagerly. At this point, the crude lines of the diagram stopped, and immediately below, between the map and the 3 names, it was evident that there had been considerable writing. But not a word of it could the young hunters make out. That writing, without doubt, had given the key to the lost gold. Rod looked up, his face betraying the keenness of his disappointment. He knew that under his hand he held all that was left of the secret of a great treasure. But he was more baffled than ever. Somewhere in this vast desolation there were 3 waterfalls, and somewhere near the 3rd waterfall the Englishman and the 2 Frenchmen had found their gold. That was all he knew. He had not found a waterfall in the chasm. They had not discovered one, in all their trapping and hunting excursions. Wabi was looking down into his face in silent thought. Suddenly he reached out and seized the sheet of bark and examined it closely. As he looked, there came a deeper flush in his face. His eyes brightened, and he gave a cry of excitement. "By George, I believe we can peel this!" he cried. "See here, Muki!" He thrust the birch under the old Indian's eyes. Even Mukoki's hands were trembling. "Birch bark is made up of a good many layers, each as thin as the thinnest paper," he explained to Rod as Mukoki continued his examination. "If we can peel off that first layer, and then hold it up to the light, we shall be able to see the impression of every word that was ever made on it, even though they were written 100 years ago." Mukoki had gone to the door, and now he turned, grinning exultantly. "She peel!" He showed them where he had stripped back a corner of the film-like layer. Then he sat down in the light, his head bent over, and for many minutes he worked at his tedious task, while Wabi and Rod hung back in soundless suspense. Half an hour later, Mukoki straightened himself, rose to his feet, and held out the precious film to Rod. As tenderly as though his own life depended upon its care, Rod held the piece of birch, now a silken, almost transparent sheet, between himself and the light. A cry welled up into his throat. It was repeated by Wabi. And then there was silence, a silence broken only by their bated breaths and the excited thumpings of their hearts. As though they had been written but yesterday, the mysterious words on the map were disclosed to their eyes. Where Rod had made out only 3 letters, there were now plainly discernible the 2 words, "Third Waterfall," and very near to these was the word "cabin." Below them were several lines, clearly impressed in the birch film. Slowly, his voice trembling, Rod read them to his companions. "We, John Ball, Henri Langlois, and Peter Plante, having discovered gold at this fall, do hereby agree to joint partnership in the same, and do pledge ourselves to forget our past differences and work in mutual goodwill and honesty, so help us God. Signed, John Ball, Henri Langlois, Peter Planté. At the very top of the map, the impression of several other words caught Rod's eyes. They were more indistinct than any of the others, but one by one he made them out. A hot, blurring film seemed to fall over his eyes, and he felt as though his heart had suddenly come up into his throat. Wabi's breath was burning against his cheek, and it was Wabi who spoke the words aloud. Cabin and head of chasm. Rod went back to the table and sat down, the precious bit of birch bark under his hand. Mukoki, standing mute, had listened and heard, and was as if stunned by their discovery. But now his mind returned to the moose steak, and he placed it on the stove. Wabi stood with his hands in his pockets, and after a little he laughed, a trembling, happy laugh. "Well, Rod, you've found your mine. You are as good as rich." "You mean that we have found our mine," corrected the white youth. "We are three, and we just naturally fill the places of John Ball, Henri Langlois, and Peter Planté. They are all dead. The gold is ours." Wabi had taken up the map. "I can't see the slightest possibility of our not finding it," he said. "The directions are as plain as day. We follow the chasm, and somewhere in that chasm we come to a waterfall. A little beyond this, the creek that runs through the gorge empties into a larger stream, and we follow this second creek, or river, until we come to the third fall. The cabin is there, and the gold cannot be far away." He had carried the map to the door again, and Rod joined him. "There is nothing that gives us an idea of distance on the map," he continued. "How far did you travel down the chasm?" 10 miles at least," replied Rod. "And you discovered no fall?" "No." With a splinter picked up from the floor, Wabi measured the distances between the different points on the diagram. "There is no doubt but what this map was drawn by John Ball," he said after a few moments of silent contemplation. "Everything points to that fact. Notice that all of the writing is in one hand, except the signatures of Langlois and Planté, and you could hardly decipher the letters in those signatures if you did not already know their names from this writing below. Ball wrote a good hand, and from the construction of the agreement over the signatures, he was a man of pretty fair education. Don't you think so? Well, he must have drawn this map with some idea of distance in his mind. The second fall is only half as far from the first fall as the third fall is from the second, which seems to me conclusive evidence of this. If he had not had distance in mind, he would not have separated the falls in this way on the map. Then, if we can find the first fall, we can figure pretty nearly how far the last fall is from the head of the chasm," said Rod. "Yes. I believe the distance from here to the first fall will give us a key to the whole thing." Rod had produced a pencil from one of his pockets, and was figuring on the smooth side of a chip. "The gold is a long way from here at the best, Wabi. I explored the chasm for 10 miles. Say that we find the first fall within 15 miles. Then, according to the map, the second fall would be 20 miles from the first, and the third 40 miles from the second. If the first fall is within 15 miles of this cabin, the third fall is at least 75 miles away." Wabi nodded. "But we may not find the first fall within that distance," he said. "By George!" He stopped and looked at Rod with an odd look of doubt in his face. "If the gold is 75 or 100 miles away, why were those men here, and with only a handful of nuggets in their possession? Is it possible that the gold played out? That they found only what was in the buckskin bag? If that were so, why would they have fought to the death for the possession of the map?" argued Rod. Mukoki was turning the steak. He had not spoken, but now he said, "Maybe going to post for supplies." "That's exactly what they were doing!" shouted the Indian youth. "Muki, you have solved the whole problem. They were going for supplies." And they didn't fight for the map. Not for the map alone." His face flushed with new excitement. "Perhaps I am wrong, but it all seems clear to me now," he continued. "Ball and the two Frenchmen worked their find until they ran out of supplies. Wabinosh House is over 100 years old, and 50 years ago that was the nearest point where they could get more. In some way, it fell to the Frenchmen to go. They had probably accumulated a hoard of gold, and before they left, they murdered Ball. They brought with them only enough gold to pay for their supplies, for it was their purpose not to arouse the suspicion of any adventurers who happened to be at the post. They could easily have explained their possession of those few nuggets. In this cabin, either Langlois or Plante tried to kill his companion, and thus become the sole possessor of the treasure, and the fight, fatal to both, ensued. I may be wrong, but, by George, I believe that is what happened." "And that they buried the bulk of their gold somewhere back near the third fall?" "Yes. Or else they brought the gold here, and buried it somewhere near this very cabin." They were interrupted by Mukoki. "Dinner ready," he called. End of chapter 12.